What is happening, guys? MS4 critical thinking video walkthrough. So MS4 and CMS18, though it was called critical thinking, it was pretty much a maths lesson. It was speed, distance, time calculations, priming them for a Planex. With CMS21, we are really doing a deep dive into critical thinking as a concept. So we're drawing on elements from CABS, the Communicative and Applied Behavioral Science that you would have done at Sandhurst, and we're getting them to really understand critical thinking. So the objectives here are to help them to understand some of the biases that we suffer, how this applies to being a soldier in the army, and then we will get them to apply it in some military and non-military case studies as well. The best and most impactful way to understand biases is to expose them through an activity. So the first thing we're going to do to engage them in the topic is do this activity. The instructions for doing it are on the board. It's quite simple. Half the class leave the room, half stay. The ones that stay, click here. You get them to remain and not talk. Then you click the icon button there, and there are more instructions. Note the paper here that's required for this activity you can get from the Edwing office in an envelope in the critical thinking pigeonhole. Collect that and give it to the recruits. Get them to answer the question that's on there. It's the same question, though you tell them that it's a different question. And that is, what is the distance from the Earth to the Moon on average? Once they give their answer, you collect the papers back in and you keep them for later. At this point, you get the half of the recruits who have left the room back into the room, and then you show them this screen. And you ask them openly and publicly, and now you're aiming your questions only to those that have just come back into the room, not who stayed behind. You ask them this question, and hopefully a confident person will put up their hand and they'll say, oh, I reckon, yeah, it's about 1 million. So you write that down, for example, and then someone else will pipe up and say, yeah, maybe 1.3 million. And then someone else will say, 1.1. And hopefully you see what's going on here, which is they're anchoring their answers to the first person who spoke. The trick is to get them to recognize that. So you'd say to one of the people who stayed in the room in the first group, okay, guys, do you want to explain to the guys who just come in how we ran that activity differently? And they'll say, yeah, we did it anonymously. We put it on a piece of paper. We all thought we had different questions. Then you say, okay, how do you expect the answers to be different? And it's important you ask them this question because sometimes you won't get the answers that you want. So you need them to recognize what's happening themselves regardless, and hopefully they'll say, yeah, the answers will be more honest, and there'll be a wider range of answers as well because we're answering more honestly. A typical response of this activity is on the screen here, so you can see the answers that you might expect from each group. So a smaller range in the public setting because they're anchoring, and a wider range in the private, more honest answers that were given. What is happening, what explains the difference, that is anchoring. Information about that here, some more information about that here. It's used in marketing, for example, to influence perception of value. And FYI, this is the answer of the distance from the Earth to the Moon. Then you have a discussion about how anchoring relates to being a soldier in the British Army. They go away a few minutes, discuss in their groups about how it does. They'll come back to you with hopefully some answers like, judging distances or scrambling on the lines, getting ready because they've seen someone else do it and they're not sure why. Or maybe more dangerous things like groupthink and not speaking out when they've seen somebody do something wrong. Because anchoring is a form of groupthink. It's the dark side of teamwork, in effect. And now teamwork, they would have had deep experience of this in the CMS so far, buddy system, get around each other, get amongst it, mutual support. And there's a video here to illustrate that. But the dark side of teamwork may have been less apparent. So it's important to have a discussion around groupthink, gang mentality, and the bystander effect. So for this, we're using the Stanford Prison Experiment, which you should be familiar with from Sandhurst. You might want to read into it for this lesson if you're not familiar with it, but this is a trailer of a film based on that experiment, which had to be abandoned because it went so badly wrong and normal people turned evil just because of the role that they were in. But do read into that because it's very important for this lesson. But how does groupthink, gang mentality, and bystander effect, how does it apply to being a soldier, and why does it matter? So ask them, if they recognize this person on the screen, this nice smiley individual. They may or may not. It's Sabrina Hardman from the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, with her colleague there presiding over some bodies. And there's some more information about it here. Okay, yeah, how about the British? Do we have our own history here? Yes, we do. Baha Musa, the killing of. And more information about that here as well. So these are quite hard-hitting cases, quite impactful, and that's the point. I think it's important to own this history if we don't want them to happen again, and we want them to be thinking critically. And it's important to use scenarios where their critical thinking is tested so that they can overcome it. So do have a frank discussion at this point. Give them a break. It's important that you do. They might need it. And then you go into defining what critical thinking is. You're going to be using a word cloud here. So we need to start ProConnect. Here, start, open the room, and then start over for the word cloud. They'll start feeding in ideas. Use this as a springboard to a discussion. That will lead you to the next bit, which is diving into more detail about what critical thinking is. Ask them if they notice here 2 different types of thinking. It should come back with some answers such as, drill, CBRN, weapon handling very much focuses on training for certainty, muscle memory, conditioning responses. Whereas in the second column, it's more about uncertainty and educating and thinking flexibly, coming up with answers in an uncertain situation. And so in phase 1 training, they're very much focusing on this type of training, this type of thinking, and very little on the second, on the thinking flexibly. So we need to develop this into their careers as well going forward, and that's why we are doing this now. So how do we actually think critically? What can we practically do to achieve this? One of the ways is to identify the things that constrain our thinking. And so for this lesson, we're going to use the expression thinking outside the box, which is a platitude. It's a horrible cliche, but conceptually it's quite useful because it implies there is a box and there are things that constrain us and there are things in the way preventing us from achieving the kind of thinking that we need for that particular moment. So that's what we're going to focus on here. And we're going to look at some of the external and external factors that make up this box. One of which we've touched on already, which is the situation and the role. That's the Stanford prison experiment, where the prison wardens their behavior is channeled by the role that they're in. They start behaving according to what they think a prison warden how they behave. But there are other things as well. So internal reasons like your own attitude, your personality, and your physical condition can all change the way that you respond in any given situation. And heuristics, which we'll come on to after this slide, which is just a mental shortcut, a very fancy term for a very simple concept, really. But there are other external things as well, such as your culture, society, and education, which we'll touch on towards the end. So your heuristics, you get one person to read out the text on the left. It's very simple to do, even though that is all jumbled up, because that's your heuristics working there. And on the right, you get someone else to read out first the text, so yellow, blue, orange, black, red, green, purple, and then say the color, which is much harder. So green, red, blue, yellow. You have to think about it because that's your 2 systems conflicting as you're doing it. And so you get them to watch the video and answer the questions. That explains the 2 systems of thinking and the heuristics better. And then you can look at some of the biases that fall out of that. So there are over 150. You get them to try and discuss what they think these biases are, and then you can click on them and there's a bit of information on every one, and you can expand on that as much or as little as you like. Finally, we look at culture and how this might constrain the way that we think, or at least color the way that we think. So you get them to look at what's on the screen. Some people will see, say, an indigenous person from America looking up, or they'll see an Inuit or an Eskimo looking into a cave or into the dark or something like that, or a hooded person looking into a cave. The second one, they'll see, say, a young person with a pronounced jawline looking away, or they'll see an elderly person with a large nose looking down, for example. And this is because the society and the culture you belong to shapes and constrains what you see, what you believe, and what you value. So then we finish off with a discussion on values and how culture might shape your values. So you have to click on this link here, and it takes you to a video, which is a BBC documentary on the bystander effect, which is really good, really thought-provoking video. You show them the questions before we watch the video, get them to think about them while they're watching them. It's important that you do that, otherwise they'll just blankly watch it. And at the end, you have a discussion about this and about how this applies to the army and how we might overcome this. And crucially, overcoming some of these biases is the topic for the next lesson. So the link to the next lesson, problem solving, decision making, is here. And then we look forward to MS5 next.